Connor Tomlinson, welcome back to The Next Generation.
Appreciated. I'm making it my ambition to be your Gad Sad. We're going to be on like 20 episodes by the time we're 30.
Well, we'll have to do another podcast or two next week then.
Yeah. Hyper compress it. Yeah.
Last time you were on, I asked you at the very end of the interview if we can fill this crisis of meaning without religion. And then we ran out of time. So you kind of just said no, and we left it there. Why can't we solve the crisis of meaning without religion?
Okay, so I think a lot of people in the new atheist movement had very good intentions, and they thought that you could build a consensus morality off of scientific truth claims. The problem that we've seen is if you disconnect science from some sort of underlying morality which values telling the truth in and of itself, science becomes a sort of tool for pursuing ideological ends. This is what a large amount of our respective lifetime was eaten up with for COVID, of where trust the science became itself a religious mantra, which meant outsource all of your critical thinking capacities to whoever the managerial regime had appointed as an expert that given day. And then it comes out on various topics, let's take mask mandates, for example, that they just straight up lied. And they admit they lied. And they said, well, we said that masks did work, then they didn't work, but we only told you they didn't work because we wanted to stockpile PPE, and then we told you they did work when it was available again. So it means that they didn't value truth enough to apply it, scientific principles, in pursuit of human flourishing. Rather, it was in pursuit of ideological ends. And so you can't build some sort of binding consensus off the basis of scientific observations or rational thought experiments, especially because if you don't start with a truthful premise, yes, all of your logical premises that flow out from there might be coherent, but if the original truth claim is not correct, then it's a little bit like saying brick walls don't exist, so I can run around with my eyes closed. Eventually your nose is going to run smack bang into one and you're going to regret getting the original premise wrong. So all of that is to say you need a sort of binding ethic, preferably that got things right before the age of empirical testing, and perhaps even gave rise to the scientific tradition. And I would say that's Christianity, not just because thou shalt not bear false witness is one of the 10 commandments, but because it solves the question of why do you value human life in and of itself. If you want a good primer to this, anyone who's watching, Tom Holland's book Dominion is a comprehensive overview of the history of the development of, he says, the Western mind, but it's Christian thought. He goes as far as to say wokeness is itself spawned from Christianity. I think it's an aberration rather than a kind of red-headed stepchild. And I think his chapter on the 1960s is the thinnest possible reading of that period. However, I do think he makes a compelling argument in that if left to its own devices without the influence of Christianity, the Roman Empire would still have been executing babies by burying them under the foundations of brothels and subjugating women to the power and appetites of the most predatory and violent man. It was only Christianity that stated the revolutionary concept that children themselves will inherit the kingdom of heaven, and that the weak and feebled have as much capacity for moral dignity as the strongest man, and that in the eyes of Christ, God, kingdom of heaven, men and women are indivisible. It's not that they're identical, it's that they're capable of equal moral consideration. No other, to my knowledge, religion or moral system has cracked that nut, and Christianity did so thousands of years ago. And I'm very much the C.S. Lewis argument on this, in that if it works in all times and all places, then it seems to be the most likely belief system that is representative of a common human moral experience. So if you're looking for that objective morality, this seems to be our best bet.
There's a lot to unpack there, as there would be with a question regarding the crisis of meaning. But I guess the start point would be, why does truth matter for meaning? I mean, seriously, especially if you have an atheist worldview, why does truth matter? We're optimized for survival, not truth. And you say that you'd run into a brick wall if you pretend it doesn't exist. I think that's quite a trite example compared to something maybe a bit deeper and something to do with the human condition. I mean, maybe it is important to optimize for survival and believe certain delusions rather than necessarily honing in on the truth. And you may run into some brick walls, but overall, if you optimize for delusions that work, like Christianity may well be, then actually that leads to better outcomes and you feel more fulfilled.
Okay, I will push back on the idea that the brick wall analogy is trite, considering we just spent the last 5 to 10 years debating whether or not we can tell what a man and a woman is. So I think civilization has gone so fundamentally astray from its foundational axioms that we really are reassessing whether or not we're looking at the same thing and whether or not the limits of reality are confines that we can accept. I mean, Mao famously went to war against nature and it ended in famine. Same thing happening here with the gender stuff. As far as whether or not we should value truth claims and instead just abide by comforting and useful delusions, I would then answer with a proposition that will make atheists or positive nihilists a little uncomfortable, which is, okay, that's fine. How are you going to have human rights? Because they're very keen on binding treaties and international laws, the rule of law. And if you hollow out the underlying ethic, which inarguably was Christianity, because it spawned the term human rights, and you make morality a set of guidelines which those who don't believe it, especially if they have power, work to circumvent for their own ends, then your human rights doctrines are obsolete. They are, as I think I said last time, a wish list of like, I just add the prefix I hope to the front of any of them, and that's as far as you're going to get. If you do want to abandon Christianity as a sort of polite fiction, then more honestly, you end up in the sort of resurgent Nietzschean Darwinian framework that we're seeing from some of the neo-pagans, neoclassicists on the right that say wokeness is a form of victim worship. It's weak, it's pathetic. So we should have, in a post-Christian society, no moral regard for them. We should go back to treating them as the Greeks and the Romans did and discard the blue-haired gender freaks like a baby on a Spartan hillside. And again, that's a coherent philosophy. I would say it's a rather harsh and in some respects inhumane philosophy. It's the more intellectually honest one. However, I don't see how atheists can reconcile that train of logic which leads there and also cling on to their desires to be anti-racist, anti-misogynistic, protect human rights.
It's a double standard for sure. And I think it's a big problem with trying to be a humanist, for example, without being a Christian. You want to have all these human rights because sort of human flourishing is self-evident, but it's a circular argument.
It's not. It's certainly not self-evident to, I don't know, Ted Bundy.
And human evolution where it's survival of the fittest.
Oh, it's incredibly tribal. Yeah.
And it relies on the strongest person destroying all others effectively.
Yes. This is why when Rory Stewart had that argument with J.D. Vance, he was appealing to Christian principles, and J.D. Vance was saying, no, ordo amoris means the hierarchical arrangement of your loves to ensure that you service those to who you should have loyalty, like your family and your friends, your congregation, your community, your nation. Then the broader world after that makes the most sense. I mean, the commandment to love thy neighbor as thyself, you have to know who your neighbor is and what is best for them in order to administer that love. You can't just have a sort of general, all-encompassing good feeling to the rest of the world. This is what the famous, I know it's been turned into a meme now, but you know, the heat maps of moral consideration that Jonathan Haidt looked at. It's kind of absurd if the locus of your moral consideration is more with rocks, trees, inanimate objects, and the universe in general than it is your own family. I would suggest, much like Aristotle once said, if your moral system ends up in the place that murder is good, you might have gotten something wrong in your fundamental premises. I would suggest that if your moral consideration is as wide as inanimate objects and people you could possibly never hope to know and therefore not know what is good for them, something has gone astray in your moral calculations.
Let's close this loop on truth being a necessity for meaning. I think with the trans thing, like it's a great point. They are running at a brick wall by ignoring fundamental biology, right? But isn't that also what Christianity does when they say someone walked on water?
Yes. I mean, that's making a claim that tests the boundaries of credulity. And that's the faith element. I mean, okay, so this is the thing I've always struggled with, because I'm very much of the same mental build, not in terms of intelligence, but in terms of character, as Jordan Peterson is. I can tell why Jordan Peterson says he won't be a Christian, because he isn't 100% certain. That's where the faith part comes in and finishes that, the ability to say with conviction that you are. But I think that he, in full intellectual honesty, doesn't want to say that he is a Christian. I know he sort of has, but he doesn't want to say it with conviction until he is absolutely certain. I think, again, C.S. Lewis makes a good argument on this, in where he says, okay, if you look at the Christian ethic, if played out in all times and all places, it leads to peace, prosperity, and human flourishing without needing to homogenize and liquidate cultural particularities, different family structures. Like, it's not rebuilding the Tower of Babel when you take the Gospel of Matthew's final line seriously and say, go forth and be a minister to all nations. In order to minister to nations, you have to respect the differences of nations and understand how to speak to people in their cultural settings. So if it works in all times and all places, there's three possibilities here. Either the claims made in the Bible by Christ and all the associated stories were made by a madman who just happens to have got it right. Either he is the world's greatest liar, an absolute charlatan, and an incredible con man who managed to have pulled the wool over everyone's eyes for centuries. Or there is something to the claims and the stories. Again, we cannot empirically verify how true those stories are, whether Sodom and Gomorrah was leveled to ash, whether Jonah survived inside the belly of a whale, whether Christ can walk on water. But if the ethic there is true for all peoples everywhere, then there must be something to it that our search for certainty, well, it might not be satisfied by adhering to it, but there is a truth to it.
But what you're alluding to is the whole liar, lunatic, or Lord thing.
Yes.
And I never really understood this, because surely there's also the option that he just didn't say any of those things, and that what was written down is not congruent with what actually went down at the time. And there are loads of issues with that as well. Would apostles be put to death for a lie? So that there are problems with that argument too. But I never really understood this false trichotomy, I guess you could call it, of liar, lunatic, or Lord.
I think Andrew Clavin puts it well when he says that the Gospels can be read as works of journalism, which is why they're flawed, but why they have significant overlap. And then each of the authors wrote in different languages, in different styles, to different peoples, because, yes, it was an evangelization strategy, but if they have correspondence in the events of their accounts, then that acts like a kind of nomological network, which proves the account to be true to an extent. Now, there's some wild stuff in the Bible. Anyone who's read Revelation, it's a hell of a trip. And I can't say whether or not the exiled Apostle John really saw all that stuff and whether or not that's going to come to pass. I mean, locusts with human faces, I might have to withhold belief on maybe that one. At the same time, again, if the ethics all line up, I'm not willing to dismiss it out of hand as a pure nonsense or even just a polite fiction. And I think as well, the reason that so many guys our age are coming back to Christianity, I mean, in France, they just had the largest cohort of catechumens baptized into the Catholic Church at Easter. 42% of them were 18 to 24. In the UK, young men's church attendance has gone up from 3% in 2018 to 18% total.
Do you believe that statistic? Because I completely don't. Like, I really can't understand why people buy into this statistic. It was done as a survey with 13,000 people by a church, some sort of Christian organization. And it's like a 1/5 of men in the UK spending at least one session in church every month. Like, I'm fascinated by the Christian argument, and I would describe myself as an agnostic. I don't go to church that often. And most people I know, again, this is anecdotal, but most people I know would never go to church. And it's like, I don't think there are 1 in 5 men that aren't Muslim in the UK at this point, let alone going to church. Obviously, that's an exaggeration.
No, but inverted. I saw this trend for quite a while, especially in political circles, because there are networks of traditional Latin Mass going Catholics that are cropping up in DC and now in London. And it is notable that that by factor of 2 to 1, Catholics are outnumbering Anglicans. So I think what's happening is in small pockets that revival is happening and it's concentrated, while lots of denominations and local churches are withering and dying, mainly because of Fulton Sheen once said they've wedded themselves to the spirit of the age, and as the age moves on, they've become widowed in the next. So we can quibble about the statistics, that's fine. I do think that there is a sincere reversion to Christianity among our age bracket.
Agreed.
That's driven by the likes of, initially, Jordan Peterson, but I also think it's driven by the fact that people can tell that there's a vacuum of meaning and there's a very strong imperially minded subculture rising up in their midst, which is Islam. Islam is very self-conscious about its political goals, its civilizational goals. It's uncompromising. It tries to present to both left behind unattractive gingers the pathway to have 72 virgins in heaven, and also to fatherless men the prospect of opulent status displays, wealth and power in the form of Andrew Tate and anyone else who, you know, leaves their country and goes to live in Dubai. And I think that there's a lot of young men who can sense that this order can't last and that their civilization is under threat, going, okay, what was the moral substrate that inspired people to build the great cathedrals, that inspired people to have children despite economic hardship? What was it? Okay, let me give this a try. We'll see how long this lasts, but I do think that is one of the motivating factors to return to the pews.
There's lots to agree with and lots to quibble with. One of the things is that I think to the layman like myself, the reversion to Christianity is certainly not a feeling of being under attack and civilizational attack. I think it's more of this search for meaning that we're speaking about rather than a defensive mechanism as such. But one of the key threads of this conversation so far is this idea of faith. And, you know, Christianity obviously overtly relies on faith, as you earlier said. But, you know, I wouldn't put that faith on a different level to the faith of being trans. That's also a faith and a leap from biological reality, just like Christianity relies on. Very different arguments, but the fact that 500 people saw Jesus resurrect, that's great. But more than 500 people believe they're trans and have written about it in great depth. I know these are very different things, but that kind of concept of faith is very similar, I think, in both of those arguments. They're both justified to the person holding it, and they both upend reality as we know it, so to speak, or at least physical laws of nature.
Well, what's most ergonomic with reality is my rejoinder. So if the Christian ethic is to be an active participant in your congregation, form a flourishing community, respect the inalienable dignity of the human person, be fruitful and multiply, show consideration to the worthy needy who for no fault of their own are disadvantaged, all of those things again seem to lead to peace and prosperity, whereas yeah, sure, you might need a degree of faith to believe that you can change sex by thought. You fundamentally can't, and it leads to the most appalling and tragic miseries ever visited upon people. Like I've had friends who've fallen down this rabbit hole, and they have had their lower body function just robbed from them. Like they can't ever have kids. And you know, that's these people they have had broken families, they have had all sorts of identity issues, they have wanted to achieve escape velocity from their own bodies because it's been a source of pain, discomfort, and misery. And instead, civilization sells them the lie that you can take a pill or have a surgery or cultivate a community around you that can affirm this new identity and everything will just be fine. And that's not the case. And so you can only run against that brick wall so long before you don't make it through the wall. You just tear your nose clean off. And so it's less about faith. I think faith is a sort of shortcut to certainty in the same way that if you're presented by 1,000 options on Amazon, as cognitive misers, you can't go through every single option and evaluate the relative quality of all of them. I mean, whoever evaluated the quality of that tripod, for example, didn't spend much time doing it. However, faith is an instrument to seek certainty, and what matters is the way you apply it and the conclusion you come to. Faith is in that respect like science.
And I think we'll both agree on the fact that all of the things you outlined that are consequences of trans ideology are evil. But, there's this sort of relative argument to make, not pitting trans ideology against Christianity, but looking at Christianity as well and saying all of these evils still took place under Christianity and we could be aiming for much better. So that those truth claims kind of both fall through, both for trans ideology and Christianity.
Which evils specifically? Because so let's say, for example, the classic example is institutional abuse in the Catholic Church. Okay, nowhere in the Bible are you going to find something that affirms that. So that is human fallibility plus the insulating effect of power that stops people from being criticized and held to account. Whereas the trans ideology is based fundamentally on a lie. And always will be. So it's whether or not you are affirming the lie versus whether or not you are ignoring it and pursuing your own hedonic ends.
Yes. And I don't want to get into a whole argument about the problem of evil, as if this is some philosophy or theology channel.
Here's something for you to contend with.
Yes.
I don't think you would have trans without liberal materialism, which is the starting place for this meaning crisis. Because if we are just, the sum total of neurons firing and hormones and our external physical appearance, then if we just play chop and change with our appendages and tinker with our hormonal balance, what's to say we aren't a man or a woman? So that's the underlying logic, and all it is at this point is just that the surgeries and the procedures are so barbaric, so obviously not working, that's caused opposition to it from Christians and liberal materialists, ex-feminists alike. Let's say that it catches up to the extent of where you could convincingly fool someone and the health effects are minimized, like you don't get cancer, you don't get sterility somehow, etc. What's the argument against it from the liberal materialist perspective?
Yeah, and I'll agree with you that I think liberal materialism has brought us to this crisis of meaning. So it's difficult, especially as an agnostic cuck that tries to sit on the fence.
I wouldn't put it that way. Come
on. But stick with me on this idea of faith a little bit longer, because it's something I've been fascinated by, and I have a suspicion that faith is a prerequisite to human flourishing. And I think that what we've lost, sure, we've got these outliers that have faith in trans ideology or whatever, if you even want to call it faith. I'm more so just entertaining that argument as, a fun thing to do. But on a real level, day-to-day people, I think there's been a great loss of faith. And I say that as someone that's not religious. If we look at faith as kind of this way of thinking rather than this religious tool or something that comes explicitly with religion, faith is just the ability to have unjustified belief that something is going to have in the future. And I would say the way we speak about faith, it's an optimistic belief of something happening. I think we've lost that. And there are many explanations for that. One of them is that I think there's more status placed on having this cerebral new atheist outlook. We're past new atheism now, but we've still got the hangover from that, which is status being attributed to being able to quantify things and explain things. And to give you an example, this is why incels, most of whom are autistic, as the data suggests.
Many such cases.
45%, I think, match the criteria for an autism diagnosis. Spoke to William Costello about this, but like most incels, they're black pill. That's what it means to be an incel. And what does it mean to be black pill? It means taking the evidence in front of you that the world sucks without having the faith that it's going to get better. And, in that case, I pick incels specifically because I think it's an autistic trait to quantify things. And I don't mean this in any derogatory way towards people that are autistic.
No, you're correct.
That's generally an autistic trait. And I think even the non-autists in society nowadays, we've also got that trait of wanting to quantify everything, and we want an explanation now. And faith isn't good enough for that.
I wonder if people have replaced faith with ritual. So this is what Freud's criticism of Christianity was that it was basically a mass form of OCD because, you know, there's the crossing and there's the use of holy water and there's the kneeling and there's the ritualistic standing up and sitting down and singing in chorus, and it provides a sort of psychological comfort blanket for people from the anxieties of death and uncertainty. And I think you're right in that faith provides a lot of people an escape from the lack of predictability in life, in the same way that if you break an autist's routine, it is pretty difficult. Like I'm a creature of habit. I just had a bit of chaos in my filming schedule this week, and it was an absolute nightmare. So I totally empathise. I wonder if the sort of treadmill nature of the consumer economy is starting to wear on people to a sufficient extent that the entirety of life feels like a means without end, and so people are trying to search for ends. And if they feel that there are no such ends, the good example is the incel one, because if you're, as a man, cultivating worth and value, then you don't just want to, you know, have a massive pile of gold that you can sit on top of like Smaug. You want to invest it in a family. You want to take care of people. You want to protect and provide. And I think the inability to invest in that wholesome natural urge has embittered a lot of young guys who they feel like the world was against them, and so they have confirmed through a long thought experiment and piecemeal bits of evolutionary psychology that the world is indeed against them, and therefore that wholesome dream is always going to be cut off from them no matter what. And so in when the rituals fail to soothe them, they seek certainty in an alternative explanation of the world, and they spec all of their faith in that, which the beliefs that you put faith into can either be self-propagating or self-limiting. So the trans ideology is self-limiting. It's literally castrative. The incel ideology, I would say, is a gelding one. It's what C.S. Lewis would put in Abolition of Man. He says, like, you've hollowed out the chests of men and then you expect virtue from them. Like, you've taken away all the avenues for men to manifest competence and strength and display virtue to the women they might end up marrying and having kids with, and then you expect them to be productive members of civilization. And any time they start complaining about that, you make a series like Adolescence and run it through the government for days. So what they've done is they've moved all of their chips into that ideology, which provides them certainty, understandably, because to move into a realm of chaos and the unknown it can be very anxiety inducing. And I think especially for men as well, we don't like feeling that we aren't in command of things. Like, a good example of this, and I can't believe I'm going to cite this book, but so Caitlin Moran's What About Men? Absolutely intolerable, right? She made one good point in the entire thing, and it was that there's a reason that men don't go to the doctors, but women constantly talk about their health ailments. It's because for women, their bodies have always been internal experiences. They've had to sort of read like the tea leaves to find out what's going on. Whereas as a man, we just move through the world because everything's very predictable to us. And like, if our arms falls off, we'll duct tape it back on sooner than admitting we have a problem, right?
And you see this with the data as well. So men are 62% more likely to be readmitted to hospital after they've been diagnosed with an issue, or they've left their contact lenses in, fallen asleep, and then woken up blind like I did the other week.
Turned into a pirate, smooth.
And now I've been recommended to not wear them for 15 days. I'm wearing them because I'm like, I confirm it, you know? And that's a very male trait, not to derail you.
No, not derailed at all. So I think a lot of these new online communities, ideologies, it feels tiresome saying incel because the government themselves constantly hyper-focus on this small group that bar one or two haven't actually done anything violent or demented. Or let's say, as we mentioned last time, the omnicause, this dedication to a suite of algorithmically derived beliefs that is summarized as Black Lives Matter, trans genocide, global intifada, and recycling. You know, all of these beliefs that don't have clear connective tissue between all of them, but they provide the sense of community, the sense of moral righteousness, and a predictability about the future that is lacking ever since Christianity has been banished from public life.
I think another element with this crisis of meaning that I think is very present, and not many people would disagree with that now, secular, Christian, whatever, is it's very well illustrated in Blaise Pascal's Ponce. And this is a complete rip from Alex O'Connor. So, Alex, this is stolen from you. And he speaks about how you can picture this man and he's trying to cure his boredom. This is the same thing that all of man's problems come from his inability to sit in a room in silence. This is the same thing. All of man's struggles spring from his inability to sit in his room in silence. That comes from the same piece. So you imagine this guy, and he's trying to pass his boredom by gambling. He's got, you could say, a gambling addiction. And he places a stake every day, and he hopes that he'll no longer be bored. So Pascal says, okay, he's doing this gambling. He wants to win. What happens if we give him this sum of money that he was going to win? He's not going to be happy, right? So he's clearly not gambling to win this money. So maybe he just enjoys gambling. So we're going to let him gamble, but he can't win any of the money. He's also not going to be happy. So he's not doing this because he enjoys gambling or because he wants to win the money. It's something along the lines of wanting something that you're not guaranteed to have, thinking you'll be happy to get it, but also not ever being able to get it. That's what this gamble is. And I think this maps quite nicely onto life. I think we put a lot of meaning in that. We get a lot of meaning from that. This is what religion ultimately is, I think. It's like the ultimate thing that you can't ever have, but you think you're going to be happy when you get it. I think that plays into all of this. And I think that's quite a neat summary, if a bit shallow, about what meaning really is.
I would dispute that only in that if you knew you were never going to win at the end, you wouldn't play the game in the first place.
This is why you have to have the belief that you could win.
That you could win, or that the rules of the game are fair, that even if the likelihood of victory is improbable, it is possible after enough attempts or enough studying the rules or enough hard work. And I think that this is why a lot of young men specifically are feeling lost, whereas young women are cleaving to grand social causes and finding identity in the herd. A lot of young men are going, right, well, the game is purposefully rigged against me. There's the Corporations Act, the Public Sector Equality Duty under the Equality Act, there's the Charities Act. There are multiple pieces of government legislation that says if you are a straight white man, you just cannot have a job in the public sector. The private sector has a duty under penalty of law to discriminate against you. If you complain about it, then you are unilaterally cracked down on social media or in person by various hate speech legislation that make the police running a protection racket on behalf of the often unearned reputation of tribal minorities. And so if you as a young man are interpreting your state as being frankly hostile to you, the market as punishing your competence, and the culture regarding you as an avatar of historical, patriarchal, racial oppression, then you're just going to check out of the game. And this is why lots of guys are not dating. This is why lots of guys are wasting a lot of their youthful exuberance and competence on games and gambling addictions and pornography. And this is why a lot of them, I've had this before. Like when I first joined Lotus Eaters, how many years ago? Blimey, about 3-ish now. I said this sort of stuff as saying, quit porn, maybe spend a little bit less time on video games than not when you're listening to the podcast, build communities, do tangible things with your hands, try dating even though the apps suck, here's how you can make them better. And some people were genuinely encouraged, and other people clung to the substantive fiction, but still a fiction, that it's so rigged against them that everything is impossible. And I think that people will check out of the game entirely if they feel that there is no route to victory. And I think at the moment, the danger that is driving the crisis of meaning is the paths to victory are being wholly and purposefully closed off from some groups, whereas it's not even a ladder to victory, it's a bloody escalator at this point. They can just stand still and get given unearned rewards. And I don't think that can last either.
And I think that aligns nicely with what Pascal said. That essentially is his thing of believing you can achieve this thing, even if you maybe won't achieve it. But another thing that plays into that belief, and it's kind of related to faith that we spoke about earlier, but it's the loss of narrative as a whole. I think that's something we've certainly lost. And this even feeds into things like being proud to be British. That's not the case anymore for most Gen Zers. I wonder how much that loss of narrative is involved in this crisis of meaning as well.
I think when people can detect that the narrative is obviously absurd, it makes it harder to buy in. It's the same way that, you know, when you watch an action film where Charlize Theron is beating up 300-pound men, it just I can't suspend my disbelief sufficiently enough to do so. And on the same on the national level, if you tell me that a man plucked from Eritrea who paid a people smuggler to ferry him across the channel, who arrived on our shores yesterday and has opinions that my fiance and my sister and my mum should wear a bedsheet lest his sexual impulses be unleashed upon them. If you tell me that that man is as indistinguishably British as me by the very virtue of him standing on our soil, I think I might point some holes in that narrative. And I think I know we're skeptical of the data and sample sizes, and for very good reason, but there are repeated surveys that show that Gen Z's faith in being British has diminished. They don't see Britain as a country which represents them. I think there's 48% that Britain's a racist country, according to the Times YouGov polling that was published earlier this year. And a lot of that is that Britain represents absolutely no one in particular. So what the modern state has done in running a experimental mass immigration policy and a subsequent multicultural management policy is to pry apart all the old organic loyalties that led to a high trust society. So they've diminished the value of family, they've diminished the value of faith, of community. They have made, as even Keir Starmer has now said, a nation of strangers for themselves. And so you've just got a series of atomized, consuming and working, occasionally, individuals in direct relationship with the state. And so the state has to intervene to stop all of these individuals squabbling, especially when, for some groups more than others, tribal loyalties resurface. And in order to try and make this febrile, divided, diverse social environment work, the state has refashioned a new narrative about Britain, which is just patently absurd. I mean, even in that immigration restriction speech that Starmer gave a few weeks ago, he got up and said that immigration is an unalloyed benefit for this country because think about all the people that came over and rebuilt after the Second World War. He's referring to the Windrush. Now, look, I'm sure plenty of people in Britain today are very nice people and have either come on the Windrush or have descendants from the Windrush. Let's not pretend that they came over like pilgrims going to Plymouth Rock to settle a barren wasteland, or went from Jamaica, which is much better weather, to Britain out of the kindness of their hearts. The majority went over because they were promised lucrative jobs as bus conductors. You know, fair enough. I'm not shocked that you go for your own economic opportunity, but let's not pretend that those people are somehow our moral betters. Let's not pretend that we wouldn't have had a nice country without them, because we always had, comparative to many other countries. That's why lots of people have come here. And let's not pretend now that everyone in the world is a Briton in waiting who does want to come to Britain and live as the Romans do, rather than terraform our culture and recreate the failed conditions of their homeland. So I think there is no one binding, cohesive narrative that represents the people who would call this place home. There is no narrative which puts burdens to conform and involve themselves in the national project on newcomers and new arrivals. If anything, their completely incompatible traditions are put above the preferences of the host population. And the version of events told by our political class that increasingly everyone of every political stripe has next to no faith in, the diversity built Britain, as Rishi Sunak, again, someone nobody ever voted for, minted on a coin and grinned next to. That idea, no, nobody actually buys into it, even if they want it to be ideologically the case. So yeah, I think that without a shared and binding narrative, you cannot have a cohesive culture, but one does not exist at the moment, which makes me concerned for the for our ability to dig ourselves out of this particular hole.
Is it not enough to have a general narrative that humans are worth something and sort of take that humanist stance? Is that not enough to patch up multiculturalism and make us all get along and sort of, that's a narrative, isn't it?
That narrative is particularly culturally exclusive to the Christian, we'll say West, but mainly the English-speaking world, because we have had generations of encoding the idea of Imago Dei out of religious suppositions. This is the concept of human rights. This is why human rights have replaced Christianity as a kind of secular religion, and this is why when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights from the United Nations or the European Convention on Human Rights were passed in 1952 after the horrors of the Holocaust and nobody wanted to commit them again, they were writing down what the victorious Allies saw, Soviet Union accepted, as self-evident. And the issue is, even if you translate them into other languages, they're not self-evident to other cultures. I mean, as we've seen from the mass migration from the Muslim world, especially the grooming gang scandal that's happened recently, morality is only extended in as far as it advantages the family, the clan, or the ummah. There's this term in Arabic, there's asabaya, which basically means clannish loyalty. And so you look at every interaction, whether it's just asserting a truth claim or whether it's some sort of grave moral evil committed against the most vulnerable, and you say, would fessing up to this disadvantage my family? Would it decrease their honor and standing in relation to others? Okay, then I'll just stay silent. And we know this is the case because lots of families knew what their brothers, cousins, husbands and sons were doing in 50 towns and cities all across the UK and stayed silent. Worse still, when they were convicted, the daughters of the perpetrators would shout out in court, "I love you, Dad." Yes, exactly. So it's all well and good to say, like Rory Stewart, I have this abstract universalist love for all humanity, even if I don't know them. That is very culturally particular. And it would take probably centuries, as it did for our culture, to reach a sufficient state where that seems self-evident to them. And they are, again, the centuries that they are behind us is a stumbling block. I would just say, leave them to their own devices, allow them to develop a morality in their own standing, and obviously don't fund the demented governments, as we are giving foreign aid to places like Pakistan or Iran, who are inflicting untold horrors upon their recalcitrant population. Instead, what we've done is, because of the narrative of the Second World War, that the absolute worst thing to be ever is a racist, and racist is defined as just noticing differences between peoples, nations, and cultures, not thinking that someone's inferior because of the color of their skin, which originally the term racist wasn't even applied to that. That was bigotry. That was like sort of arbitrary prejudice against someone because they just look different to you, which we abhor. Because of the Second World War narrative that if you're a racist, you're literally Hitler. Hitler killed lots and lots of people. Therefore, you don't want to be Hitler. Therefore, the most moral thing to do in the world is not to consult your own conscience. Just think of what Hitler did and do the opposite. We now pretend, or at least act as if it is true as a matter of government policy, that there are no such thing as cultural differences. Everything's arbitrary. People are just pried apart by the cruel injustice of geography, and that any difference in education, economic attainment, or cultural preference can be eradicated by just taking a man from Mogadishu and dropping him in Manchester. As if the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick are magic portals through which you pass and you suddenly become showered in British values and you just pick up peace and prosperity by cultural osmosis. And this is a fiction that is ultimately costing a lot of people money, pain and suffering, and ultimately lives. And so I don't think that we should continue to perpetuate the narrative that bland Scouts pledge of British values, which means, tolerance and liberalism and a general love of humanity, is sufficient to bind everyone together from all corners of the world.
I think something I've discovered the last year is how powerful the stories we tell ourselves are. And it sounds dumb in some senses to say, if you don't have the same shared story or narrative, there are going to be these problems that are happening. It kind of sounds like an underestimation of human potential. Like, sure, you might have different stories, but we can all agree that humans are amazing and deserve to flourish. But it's like, what are the presuppositions underlining that? And that's a very difficult thing to grapple with. And that's kind of been what has red-pilled me, so to speak, on the whole immigration thing. And also spending a lot of time traveling and seeing these fundamentally different places with different narratives that govern everything they do in life, both morally and just on a day-to-day physical basis. I mean, those morals govern what they do every day today on a physical basis. What do you see as the trajectory now? We've just had Keir Starmer come out and give his speech that everyone's lambasted. And as usual, no one fucking likes him. What's next, both politically with the politicians and also maybe on a social level?
Okay, so the reason Starmer gave that speech is because Tony Blair has been ringing his phone red saying, you need to get a handle on this. You are bipolling the most unpopular prime minister in recorded history, and Reform are eating your lunch, especially at the local elections where they just became the largest party in England on the local level. And so he has provided anti-progressive window dressing to some twiddling of the dials on immigration that actually keeps levels of immigration above that we saw before Brexit. And Brexit in 2016 was not, as lots of the Leave.eu conservatives thought, an insistence on having more liquid trade with the rest of the world, or holding the EU to account on not allowing us to be Singapore on Thames, or bringing in more Indian doctors, which, by the way, have a much higher rate of medical malpractice than our own doctors. After we put a cap on the number of medical school places we allow here, to not devalue the profession. Work that one out. No, it was about immigration. It was about, as Eric Kaufman's written in White Shift, not just concerns of economic sustainability and whether or not infrastructure can cope with the rapid population change. A lot of those were polite couchings of ethnic and cultural change concerns. And like it or not, ethnicity and culture is bound up in one another, because there's a reason we put the prefix of a nationality or a people before a culture, like British values or American values, or even the American story or the British story, and it's because it belongs to a particular people and a place and a time. It happened, we can name them. And so if you feel yourself to be already a part of that people, you're more likely to buy into that as your story. Now, there are, again, people who have a hard break with their civilization and buy into a different story. And we can name them too. There's like Maya Tusi and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, or people who are half of one place and half another, like Ben Habib. Not every person from Somalia is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Not every person from Pakistan is Ben Habib. And so we have to understand that they will likely be telling themselves a different story. None of that framing was evident in what Keir Starmer said. And it was telling that if you pour through the immigration white paper, very light on detail, he is farming out all of the specifics to quangos, these quasi-government NGOs that are not elected, that we have no ability to hold to account, and that believe dogmatically in the diversity, inclusion, and immigration ideology. So, are things going to get better before the next election? No. Things are going to keep getting worse. The economic situation is probably going to keep entering a death spiral because we're hemorrhaging our millionaires. Nobody wants to invest. The tax burden is the highest since 1948 and only rising. We are plundering our food security with a punitive Marxist grave robbing tax, and Mad Eb Miliband has decided to lump us with an over £3 trillion cost down the line to make the entire grid renewable, even though it's only going to meet about 27% of energy demands with no protection for blackouts. Basically, we're becoming like somewhere between Lebanon and South Africa. Not the best. Both failed states. So where are we going to be at the next election? Now, there's a tricky thing to predict. At the moment, it looks like Reform are riding high and Nigel Farage is the most likely person to become Prime Minister. I have a standing bet with Neil Ferguson that will be the case, but that is on the condition that Kemi Badenoch remains Conservative leader, and there are rumblings within the Conservative Party that they're not so happy about them slumping down to fourth place at 16% after they triumphed her as the second coming of Margaret Thatcher. So expect no confidence votes to go in and her, probably to be replaced by Robert Jenrick, who's a much better politician. But by 2029, at the going rate, we're going to have a Reform government. And I have cast myself as a critical friend of Reform in that I am very happy that there's a populist insurgent movement, but I'm worried by a few things. not their potential to win elections, as Matt Goodwin, respected academic, keeps pointing to as sort of legitimizing factor for reform and why they're the only game in town. I'm concerned about their ability to attract and retain talent after the unconscionable treatment of Rupert Lowe, where the party chairman called the police on him. The party chairman of the anti-woke party called the police on him for hurty words apparently made 3 months ago, and now he's been cleared of a police investigation. They've lost their best MP and replaced them with Sarah Pochin, who can't give a TV interview to save her life and just voted for the assisting dying bill to kill all pensioners to save money for the NHS. So I'm worried that if it keeps going in that direction and they keep employing this Ming vase strategy, so, carefully carrying the vase over the finish line to not be called racist, well, if the people that are carrying the vase by the time you get to the finish line didn't believe in carrying the vase for the first place, they're just going to drop it when you get there. And so I'm worried they're going to, in dropping the vase, they're going to look a lot more like Trump's term 1 when they win power than Trump's term 2. And that can be really damaging because, one, we don't have 5 years to screw around with the demographic and the cultural and the economic circumstances we face, but also let's say that you have this once-in-a-generation opportunity to break up the sclerotic two-party structure, the two zombies propped against each other, Labour and Conservative. You walk in and you waste the opportunity because you haven't got your ducks in a row, you haven't got a slate of credible MPs, you haven't got all your legislation drafted, you don't know who your enemies are, and you don't know which battles to pick. That would be my worry. So they need to spend 4 years listening to people who can point them in the direction of policy, who can tell them which media outlets to engage with and which to brush off as the enemy, who to choose as candidates, and get them fighting fit to capitalise on the victory which currently looks inevitable.
We've had quite an episode here speaking about the crisis of meaning, immigration, the political state of the UK. This is going to be an orgasm fest for any conservative Christians. I want to finish by sort of tying this all together here. How do we move forwards and actually look for solutions? Is it that we're kind of all caught up in the politics of things, immigration, and we're not worrying about potentially these bigger ideas like narrative and shared stories? Are these things going to be solved by certain political parties crushing others at elections? Or is this thing that's going on right now in the West just going to keep on going and going until we kind of as a population start respecting the idea of thinking about these things and being brave enough to think about them and contend with these very difficult topics?
So there's no chance that we can lick our wounds if we keep sustaining more of them. So I think that a political party with sufficient courage to tackle the taboos of the day needs to rise to power. And then culture and politics is symbiotic. It's not just the Andrew Breitbart maxim of politics is downstream from culture. Culture can be changed by changes in the law. I mean, look at Tony Blair's constitutional revolution. He put the government on rails so even though there were 14 years of Conservative government, they were indistinguishable from the prior years of Labour government. Or look at the decisions around legalising abortion and the invention of the birth control pill and the ruling on gay marriage, how it can liberalise sexual norms and have an impact on things as private as family formation. So change politics, you do change the culture to some extent. But, and I think this ties into something we were chatting about off air, the problem with our ability at the moment in political discourse, as dispersed as it is, whether it's social media, whether it's long-form podcasts, whether it's books and publishing, which is a wholly captured institution as is, it's limited by a few things. Firstly, our ability to build parallel institutions. And secondly, our ability to change the incentives if we co-opt existing institutions. So the construction of parallel institutions is rife in America. And I know they've got a lot more of an entrepreneurial spirit and they've got a lot more liquid capital flowing around. But I was talking to a high-profile American commentator earlier last week when they were visiting London, and they were just baffled by the absence of a conservative or restorative ecosystem for media and think tanks and publications and all these sorts of things. Because, Trump is ascendant at the moment over there, but the infrastructure had to be there to enable his victory and persuade more people to come over. And I just said to him, well, look, there's not much money in it, and lots of people don't like working together, and that's just the nature of the game here. Apart from the parallel institutions, a good example of this now is X. The black swan event was really Elon Musk buying Twitter, and I'm very glad he did, of course, liberalizing the discourse in the lower L sense, in the sort of English liberty sense, where I'm an Englishman and I feel entitled to speak my mind, and if you want to come take that away from me, we can have a physical dispute about it rather than, you go run crying to the cops. That's how X works now. I like that fact, but the problem that X has got is that by introducing monetization, you've added the perverse incentive to chase what is colloquially called slop. And that slopification has only increased thanks to the turning of the internet into a global village. That's the Marshall McLuhan term that he used to describe how technology homogenizes things and makes us more interconnected, but also more the same. As Wade Stotts, who's a very good American content creator, put in a recent video, it's less a global village and more like a global shanty town. Because the moment that you instantaneously interconnect countries with very different codes of social conduct and cultural suppositions with China, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, you get bot farms, outrage bait, you get gaming the system so that you create a circle of premium accounts that all interact with each other to siphon off amounts of ad revenue to yourselves, and respective to their national currencies, you can make a very good living just engagement farming on X. And so that contaminates political discourse because it means that otherwise respectable content creators feel the need to conform to those incentives. I mean, you had this debate with our mutual friend Andrew Gold, where he says, look, this is just what people are clicking on, and so I feel the need to get those conversations out there and get more people to see them. I feel the need to slopify my titles, basically. And you also get people who will jump on contentious topics and trends now that the muzzle has been lifted on certain things like gender ideology or immigration, who have a much higher output than they do an input. They don't read books. They don't know the stats on these things. They're just making it their thing because they want to be in the limelight. I think discourse is much healthier when people are doing this kind of begrudgingly. I'm not saying that to depict myself as holier than thou, but I think probably... So you're not necessarily in the political fray. You're doing things to have these nourishing conversations about meaning. This is why you're not chasing the slop stuff. For me, I'm having those contentious conversations and writing about these contentious topics, but because I feel like I'm living through the fall of the Roman Empire in real time, and if I don't at least act as stenographer, my conscience will rack me. I would much rather go back to do gardening, which is what I was doing before this, and is the only thing that gives me joy these days, because if you open Twitter, you're miserable. There are lots of people for whom, if the problem stops, the gravy train stops. So actually, they don't really want to solve problems. They just want to still be in the limelight and pivot from problem to problem. And I think that's a set of unhealthy incentives that means those bigger conversations about meaning and about filling the God-shaped hole in people's lives that are harder to monetize are marginalized compared to sensationalism.
And it all started with a good message and a good cause, these people that were tackling issues. But the problem is with our negativity bias as humans and social media apps playing on that, these people rely on problems to fund their existence. That's not a healthy structure to have. And I know that there are people in the industry that if they had a big red button they could press to get rid of these problems, they wouldn't press it because it would mean sacrificing the clout and fame and hero status they've achieved.
It's the same thing as Black Lives Matter. Like they don't actually want racial harmony because then all the money stops flowing in.
Yeah. It's disgusting.
Cynical, but yeah.
And it's evil.
Yeah.
And I think this all just comes down to a lack of personal responsibility that people need to take. And especially when you're operating in the field of culture. I mean, first of all, just going back to your point about the slopification of content, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I wouldn't put it down to the global shantytown. I think that plays into it, and that's an interesting thing to explore. But San Franciscan institutions have put these incentives in place, and these Western influencers that we're speaking about have followed. So I think that's at the root of all of these problems in the West, are Westerners who have let themselves be occupied with the pursuit of fame and likes and status and they use all of these metrics that have been put in place by the San Franciscan companies as a way of stroking their own ego and as a way of fulfilling that hole in their heart that's been in place because of this crisis of meaning. And, you know, on the point of that debate I had with Andrew Gold, I'm not against jazzing stuff up slightly. I understand that with this video now, I'm not going to take the most boring thing you said and put it as the title and thumbnail. Obviously, that's fucking obvious.
The implication of says something boring, Elliot, I'm offended.
I mean, yeah, every single word you've spoken has been title and thumbnail worthy.
Every syllable is dreamy, of course.
Yes. But the point is that when you're in the cultural space, specifically in politics, in analysis of society, you have a responsibility, especially now that YouTubers are the mainstream. Podcastistan is the main source of wisdom and knowledge, so to speak. You have a responsibility and you can't take that lightly. And people are now putting the cart before the horse. They're chasing these likes, some of which are from these bot farms that, you know, conspiratorial, but maybe set up to expedite the fall of this civilization. That's a whole rabbit hole we need a 2-hour podcast on in the future. You know, they're playing into the civilizational collapse, so to speak. And they're playing into it by constantly saying that we're in civilizational collapse without backing it up with facts, just pandering to the most extreme arguments and what gets views, and using things like Islamist Nazis and World War III and the collapse of the Roman Empire without any of the substance. I'm fine with you coming on here and saying that you feel like you're living through the collapse of the Roman Empire because you have the stats to back it up and you're not playing on fear explicitly. You've said that in the middle of what's been a very substantive podcast. The problem is when you package things that way, and the packaging is what most people see before they open. That is what people are going to remember. And that's not me dumbifying people. That's just a fact that you're going to look at more things and look at the packaging rather than watch through the content. We only have so much time in a day. So people have a responsibility. And I think that's what it comes down to is like, yeah, sure, these structures are in place where it would be faster to scare people into watching my videos. But it's like, A, they're not going to stick around. You're going to get audience captured. And B, you should be holding yourself to a higher standard. And I'm so disappointed. Like, I know I sound like this young, just turned 20-year-old.
It's all down here from here, man.
That's what Alex O'Connor said to me as well. I sound like this young guy that's naive and optimistic for the future. And, you know, I think that the world works in a fundamentally different way to how it actually does. Like, no, I think I'm advocating for people operating with morality and trying to offer value rather than indexing only on clicks, which global shantytown isn't even really an important metric anymore to judge your success by. It never has been, but now it's like even more. I think we just need people to operate on a more moral and value-based system. Is that going to happen in the next few years? No.
Well, let me make the case to people that think purely selfishly and are driven by incentives for why they should. I have seen people that came up in what I can only describe retroactively as a kind of commentary bubble. So during COVID, because a lot of the costs and consequences fell on people of our age, there were a lot of younger politically engaged people who got a fair hearing from critical new media outlets, whether that was YouTube or whether that was GB News had just launched or whether it was Talk Radio, eventually Talk TV in this country. And there was a sort of dramatic culling when people realized that that a lot more guests wanted to go on them, so they didn't have to resort to younger people to fill airtime, and that there was a mass market here so they could dump more money into it so they didn't have to fall back on these new guests. Some of them made it through, and I was, I suppose, a sort of accidental member of that's now gone on to do other things just because I've done a fair amount of research and I hope I've contributed usefully to the discourse. But there are some people that I saw that came up as very bright and burning stars, and like Icarus, their wings melted in an instant, because they would take pretty much any TV spot they were asked to do and thought, yeah, I can talk about that. But they only had enough for one question in them. And when there was a follow-up question, they sort of ran out of steam and occasionally just said some silly things on air that made them look like fools. If you want to do this for purely selfish reasons, I advocate against it, not only because if you do have a conscience, it can be a bit demoralizing at times, especially if you don't see the social side of it as a kind of subsidy. I'm actually not a very social person. I much prefer to be in bed with a book by 10. However, if you trust me, mate, if you're in Westminster, you don't want to be out after dark with some of these people. But if you are in it for purely selfish reasons, right? Think about your time horizon. Building up credibility will mean that you stick around in this industry for longer and have a larger platform over time than if you race to fill every spot and your shortcomings are self-evident to anyone watching within the first couple of months of your career. So even if it's purely for opportunism, spend a lot more time reading and researching than you are in front of a camera or tweeting. And also the last thing I will say, because you've mentioned audience capture, just don't read the comments. Like I know I have a really good close friend who she got very famous for one or two things. Very intelligent girl, absolutely great research acumen, but she had the best thing that happened to her was that she got banned from Twitter for a bit because she was spending so much time on it responding to accounts with little to no followers and therefore people she couldn't establish credibility with, that it was affecting her mood, devouring all of her time and waylaying her contributions to the wider movement. What I like to do is tweet with a purpose, only engage with people that you know in person or are like long-standing mutuals with, turn off all your notifications for people you don't follow, and when you put a take out there, you pull the pin on the grenade and just walk away and let it explode. That is a much more psychologically healthy way of dealing with this new form of communication that no human being throughout history, except this very small sliver of time, has had to grapple with, having a permanent ledger of everything you've ever said, but that we're nonetheless, because of the nature of work and politics, forced to interact with anyway.
Connor Tomlinson, thanks for coming back on, mate.
Pleasure as always.
Where can people find more of your work?
I host Tomlinson Talks on YouTube, which is a politics and current affairs show that I have revived. I write for Courage Media, and new announcements coming soon. And if you want to get my grenade-style Twitter takes, I'm at @con_Tomlinson on X.